If you're enjoying this tale of the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of courage, love, and redemption from the frontier. Your support means everything to us. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under the scorching sun of 1884, its red clay earth cracked like ancient leather. Heat waves danced above the desert floor, creating mirages that fooled even the most experienced travelers. In this unforgiving landscape, where survival meant everything and mercy was a luxury few could afford, an unlikely encounter was about to unfold. Margaret Whitmore had never known hunger, never felt the bite of desert wind against skin that hadn't been pampered with the finest lotions money could buy. Born into one of Boston's wealthiest railroad families, she had lived her 23 years surrounded by silk wallpaper, crystal chandeliers, and servants who anticipated her every need before she voiced it. But now, as her expensive traveling dress hung in tatters around her bleeding legs, as her once perfect auburn hair matted with dust and dried blood, Margaret understood that wealth meant nothing when death stalked you across the merciless desert. The stagecoach robbery 3 days ago had changed everything in moments of gunfire and screaming horses. She had been traveling west to meet her intended husband, a cattle baron. Her father had chosen to expand their business empire into the frontier. The engagement was purely transactional, as most marriages in her social circle were. Margaret had accepted her fate with the resigned grace expected of a proper Boston lady, even though her heart yearned for something more meaningful than a union built on railroad shares and beef contracts. The bandits had taken everything: her jewelry, her dowry money, her traveling companions' lives. They had left her for dead in the desert, assuming the harsh environment would finish what their bullets had started. A deep gash across her shoulder blade sent waves of fire through her body with every movement, and her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, Margaret stumbled over a cluster of rocks and fell hard onto the unforgiving ground. Her palms scraped against sharp stones, adding fresh wounds to her collection of injuries. She lay there for a moment, tasting dust and defeat. The vultures circled overhead, their shadows creating dark patches that moved across her prone form like harbingers of doom. Margaret closed her eyes and wondered if this was how her story would end. Forgotten in a nameless patch of desert, her bones bleached white by the relentless sun. That's when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats, steady and deliberate against the hard-packed earth. Margaret's eyes snapped open, hope and terror warring in her chest. Were the bandits returning to finish their work, or had rescue finally found her in this god-forsaken wilderness? The rider who appeared over the rise was unlike anyone Margaret had ever seen. He sat tall and straight on a paint horse whose coat gleamed like polished copper in the fading light. His long black hair was adorned with eagle feathers that caught the wind, and his bronze skin seemed to glow with an inner strength that spoke of countless days under the open sky. This was Ayana, whose name meant eternal blossom in his native tongue, though few white men had ever learned to pronounce it correctly. He was a warrior of the Apache people, trained from childhood in the ancient ways of survival, tracking, and healing. His people had roamed these lands for generations, reading the desert's moods like a familiar book. At 28, Ayana had already earned respect among his tribe for his skill with bow and rifle, his ability to find water where others saw only death, and his knowledge of the medicinal plants that grew in hidden canyons. But more than his physical prowess, it was his compassionate heart that set him apart from other warriors. He had been returning from a successful hunt, his horse laden with fresh venison for the elderly members of his tribe, when he spotted the figure lying motionless among the rocks. From a distance, he could see this was a white woman, probably from one of the wagon trains or stagecoaches that occasionally crossed through their territory. His first instinct was caution. Relations between his people and the white settlers had grown increasingly tense as more pioneers pushed westward, claiming land that had belonged to the Apache for countless generations. Many of his fellow warriors would have ridden past, leaving the woman to whatever fate had brought her to this place. But Ayanna had always been different. His grandmother, a wise woman known for her healing gifts, had taught him that compassion knew no boundaries of race or tribe. "The Great Spirit," she had often said, "judges us not by the color of our skin, but by the kindness in our hearts." As he approached, Ayanna could see that the woman was severely injured and near death. Her breathing was shallow and labored, her skin flushed with fever despite the desert's growing coolness as evening approached. Blood had dried in dark stains across her torn clothing, and her lips were so parched they had begun to crack and bleed. Without hesitation, Ayanna dismounted and knelt beside Margaret. She stirred at his approach, her green eyes fluttering open to meet his dark gaze. For a moment, fear flickered across her features as she took in his traditional clothing, the war paint that still marked his cheekbones from his hunting expedition, the knife at his belt. But then she saw something in his eyes that transcended cultural barriers. Genuine concern, a desire to help rather than harm. Margaret had grown up hearing terrible stories about savage Indians, tales designed to frighten proper ladies into staying safely within civilization's boundaries. Yet this man's gentle touch, as he examined her wounds, spoke of healing rather than violence. Ayanna spoke softly in his native language, words meant to calm and reassure. Though Margaret couldn't understand the Apache tongue, the tone of his voice carried comfort. He then switched to the broken English he had learned from trading with frontier merchants, his accent thick, but his meaning clear. "You hurt bad," he said, his calloused fingers gently probing the wound on her shoulder. "Need help, or you die in desert." Margaret tried to speak, but only a harsh croak emerged from her throat. Ayanna immediately reached for the water gourd tied to his horse's saddle, lifting Margaret's head with surprising gentleness and allowing her to drink small sips of the precious liquid. The water was warm but cleaner than anything she had tasted in days. As her throat began to work again, Margaret managed to whisper, "Please, don't leave me here." Ayanna studied her face, seeing past the dirt and blood to the desperation in her eyes. This woman was clearly from the world of white settlers, probably wealthy given the quality of her torn dress and the gold locket that still hung around her neck. By all rights, he should be wary of helping her. His people's experiences with white settlers had taught them that kindness was often repaid with betrayal, but his grandmother's teachings echoed in his mind. And Ayanna made his decision. "I take you safe place," he said, already calculating the distance to a hidden canyon where he sometimes camped during long hunts. "You trust me?" Margaret looked into his eyes and saw an integrity that had been absent from most of the men in her privileged world. Even in her desperate state, she recognized that this stranger offered her only chance of survival. She nodded weakly, placing her fate in the hands of a man her society would consider her enemy. With careful strength, Ayanna lifted Margaret onto his horse, positioning her in front of him so he could support her weakened body during the ride. She gasped in pain as movement awakened fresh agony in her wounded shoulder, but bit back any cry that might indicate weakness. As they rode through the gathering darkness, Margaret became aware of Ayanna's warmth at her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the sure way he guided his horse through terrain that would have been invisible to her untrained eyes. Despite everything she'd been taught about his people, she felt safer than she had in days. The hidden canyon Ayanna brought her to was a marvel of natural architecture. Towering red rock walls created a protective circle around a small oasis where a spring bubbled up from deep underground. Ancient cottonwood trees provided blessed shade, and the air was noticeably cooler than the open desert they had left behind. Ayana had discovered this place years ago during his vision quest, a sacred journey undertaken by young Apache warriors to find their spiritual path. He had never brought another person here, but something about this wounded woman's situation called for exceptional measures. Perhaps the Great Spirit had guided their meeting for reasons beyond his understanding. He helped Margaret down from the horse with the same gentle care he might show an injured bird. She was barely conscious now, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion and blood loss after days of desperate survival. Ayana quickly gathered dry wood and built a small fire, its flames casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. From his medicine bundle, he withdrew various herbs and roots his grandmother had taught him to use for healing. Willow bark for pain, purple coneflower for infection, yarrow to stop bleeding. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared poultices and teas, drawing on knowledge passed down through generations of Apache healers. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness as Ayana worked to clean and dress her wounds. When she was aware, she watched him with growing amazement. This man, whom her world would label as primitive, displayed a knowledge of medicine that rivaled anything she had seen from Boston's finest physicians. His touch was gentle but sure as he cleaned the gash on her shoulder, applied healing herbs, and bound it with strips of soft leather. He made her drink bitter teas that eased her pain and helped her body fight the infection that had begun to set in. Throughout the long night, he maintained the fire and kept watch, ensuring her safety while she slept. As dawn broke over the canyon rim, painting the rocks in shades of gold and rose, Margaret awoke feeling more human than she had in days. The fever had broken during the night, and while she was still weak, the immediate danger of death had passed. She found Ayana sitting cross-legged near the fire, his dark eyes studying her with quiet intensity. "Thank you," she said, her voice still hoarse but stronger than before. "You saved my life." Ayana nodded solemnly. In his culture, saving a life created a bond of responsibility that transcended tribal boundaries. This woman was now under his protection, whether she understood it or not. But he also recognized that her presence in his hidden sanctuary created complications that would need careful handling. As Margaret recovered her strength over the following days, she and Ayana began to communicate beyond the basic necessities of survival. Her education had included French and Latin, but no native languages. However, necessity proved an excellent teacher, and gradually they developed a mixture of English, Apache words and gestures that allowed for more complex conversations. Margaret learned that Ayana was not just a warrior, but also a skilled tracker, hunter, and healer who held an important position within his tribe. He had been educated in the old ways by his grandmother, learning to read signs in nature that white men never noticed, to find sustenance in a landscape that appeared barren to untrained eyes. For his part, Ayana was intrigued by Margaret's stories of the eastern cities, of great buildings that reached toward the sky, of machines that could carry messages across vast distances in mere moments. Her world seemed as foreign to him as his did to her, yet he found himself drawn to her intelligence and resilience. Margaret had never met anyone like Ayana. The men in her social circle were pale shadows compared to his quiet strength and genuine nobility. He possessed a natural dignity that had nothing to do with inherited wealth or social position. His word was his bond, his compassion genuine rather than performed for social advantage. As the days passed in the hidden canyon, Margaret's physical wounds healed under Ayana's expert care. But she began to realize that her emotional wounds ran far deeper than anything the desert bandits had inflicted. Her entire life had been lived according to other people's expectations, her desires and dreams subordinated to family obligations and social requirements. For the first time, living in this simple camp with a man who asked nothing of her except to heal and be herself, Margaret began to discover who she truly was beneath the layers of proper upbringing and social conditioning. She found herself laughing at Ayana's dry humor, fascinated by his stories of desert survival, moved by his deep reverence for the natural world. Ayana, too, found himself changing. Margaret's quick intelligence and curious nature challenged him to see his own world through fresh eyes. Her questions about Apache customs and beliefs forced him to articulate traditions he had always simply lived, deepening his own understanding of his heritage. But their peaceful interlude could not last forever. On the seventh day after Ayana had found her, the sound of approaching riders echoed off the canyon walls. Margaret's heart clenched with fear as she recognized the voices calling her name. Her family had finally organized a search party, and somehow they had tracked her to this hidden refuge. The men who rode into the canyon were led by Margaret's older brother Thomas, a stern businessman who had inherited their father's ruthless approach to obstacles. Behind him rode a dozen armed men, including the sheriff from the nearest town and several hired gunmen whose hands rested casually on their weapons. Thomas Whitmore took in the scene with barely contained rage. His sister, dressed in crude native clothing that Ayana had fashioned from soft deerskin, sitting beside a fire with an Apache warrior. Her skin was tanned from days in the sun, her hair loose and free rather than pinned in the elaborate styles fashion demanded. She looked more alive and vibrant than he had ever seen her, which somehow made his anger burn even brighter. "Margaret!" Thomas's voice cracked like a whip across the canyon. "Thank God we found you alive. This savage hasn't harmed you, has he?" Margaret rose slowly to her feet, acutely aware of the tension that had suddenly filled their peaceful sanctuary. Ayana stood beside her, his hand resting on his knife handle, ready to defend her if necessary, despite being vastly outnumbered. "Harmed me?" Margaret's voice carried a strength that surprised everyone present, including herself. "Thomas, this man saved my life. He found me dying in the desert and nursed me back to health. If not for his kindness and skill, you would be collecting my bones rather than finding me alive." Thomas's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. The idea that his sister owed her life to an Indian was almost more than his prejudiced mind could accept. "Regardless," he said stiffly, "you're coming home immediately. Father is worried sick, and your intended husband has been notified of your situation." The word situation carried implications that made Margaret's stomach turn. She realized that in her brother's mind, and likely in the minds of their entire social circle, her time with Ayana had somehow tainted her, made her less suitable for the marriage that had been arranged. "I'm not going back," Margaret said quietly, the words surprising even herself as they emerged. "Not to that life, not to marry a man I've never met for reasons that have nothing to do with love or happiness." Thomas's hand moved to his pistol. "You'll come home, Margaret, even if I have to drag you, and this Indian will hang for kidnapping and assault. He did no such thing." Margaret stepped protectively in front of Ayana, her green eyes blazing with an anger that matched her brother's. "He saved me, cared for me, asked nothing in return. If anyone should hang, it should be those bandits who robbed our stage and left me for dead." The sheriff, a weathered man named Patterson, who had dealt with his share of Indian troubles, studied the situation with more objectivity than Thomas could manage. He could see that the woman was obviously unharmed and defending the Apache warrior rather than accusing him. Her story had the ring of truth to it. "Ma'am," Patterson said carefully, "are you saying this Indian helped you of his own free will, that he never threatened or harmed you in any way?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Margaret replied firmly. "Ayana saved my life and asked for nothing in return. He is a good man, more honorable than most of the men I've known in so-called civilized society." Ayana had remained silent during this exchange, understanding more English than he spoke, reading the dangerous currents flowing between the family members. He knew that his life hung in the balance, that these white men could justify killing him with little consequence to themselves, But more importantly, he could see the pain in Margaret's eyes as she faced the choice between two worlds. She had found something precious in their time together, a sense of her own worth and identity that had nothing to do with social expectations or family obligations. Now that discovery was being threatened by the very people who claimed to love her. "I stay with Ayana," Margaret said suddenly, her voice carrying across the canyon with startling clarity. "He has shown me more kindness and respect in these few days than I received in 23 years of your so-called protection. I choose him and his world over the empty existence you want to force on me." The silence that followed her declaration was deafening. Thomas stared at his sister as if she had lost her mind, unable to comprehend how a woman of her breeding could choose to live among savages rather than return to the comfort and prestige of their family name. "You're ill," Thomas said finally, his voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. "This experience has obviously affected your judgment. Once you're home and properly cared for, you'll see the madness of what you're saying." But Margaret's resolve had been building like water behind a dam, and now it burst forth with years of suppressed rebellion. "I've never been more sane in my life, Thomas. I've finally found someone who sees me as a person, rather than a commodity to be traded for business advantages. I won't go back to being a decorative object in your world." Ayana stepped forward, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "I speak," he said, looking directly at Thomas. "Your sister speak truth. I find her dying. Bring her safe place. Heal wounds. Ask nothing from her, take nothing from her. She free to go when she choose." Thomas laughed bitterly. "Free? You think we're fools, Indian? You've obviously bewitched her somehow, filled her head with savage ideas. No civilized woman would choose your primitive life over everything we can offer her." "Maybe," Ayana replied calmly. "Your civilization not so good for women if they choose different way when they see it." The simple truth of his words hit like a physical blow. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes as she realized that Ayana understood the prison. Her privileged life had become better than her own family did. He had offered her something no amount of money could buy, the freedom to be herself. Sheriff Patterson cleared his throat uncomfortably. He had wives and daughters of his own, and he could see the genuine affection between the Apache warrior and the white woman. While such relationships were scandalous by social standards, he had seen enough of life to know that love sometimes crossed boundaries that society preferred to maintain. "Miss Whitmore," he said diplomatically, "are you certain about this decision? Once you make this choice, there'll be no going back. Your family, your social position, everything you've known will be lost to you." Margaret looked around the canyon that had become her sanctuary, at the man who had saved her life without asking for anything in return, at the brother whose love came with chains she could no longer bear. The choice was difficult, but ultimately clear. "Sheriff, what I'm losing never truly belonged to me anyway. It was all borrowed, contingent on my obedience and compliance. What I'm choosing is mine, my choice, my life, my heart." Thomas's face turned purple with rage. "Fine!" he spat. "Choose your savage over your family. But don't expect us to rescue you when reality sets in, when you realize what you've thrown away for this romantic foolishness." He turned to his men, his voice harsh with authority. "We're leaving. She's made her choice, and she can live with the consequences." As the sound of departing horses faded from the canyon, Margaret felt a mixture of grief and liberation wash over her. She had just severed ties with everything she had ever known, burned bridges that could never be rebuilt. The magnitude of her decision was beginning to sink in. Ayana approached her quietly, his dark eyes full of understanding. "You sure about this choice?" he asked gently. "Life with my people not easy, many hardships, many who will not accept white woman among us." Margaret turned to face him, seeing in his weathered features a strength and nobility that had nothing to do with inherited privilege. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said. But I have to ask you the same question. Are you willing to accept me, to face the challenges my presence will bring to your people?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment, considering not just his own feelings, but the welfare of his tribe. Taking a white woman as his wife would create tensions, possibly even violence. Some of his people harbored deep hatred for all whites, having lost family members to the army's brutal campaigns against the Apache. But he also knew that his grandmother had always taught him to follow his heart when it aligned with honor and compassion. This woman had shown courage in choosing an uncertain future over a comfortable prison. She deserved the same courage from him. "My heart chose you long ago," he said simply. "My people learned to accept what cannot be changed. We make our own path." As autumn gave way to winter in the high desert country, Margaret learned to live in ways she had never imagined possible. Ayana took her to meet his people, a small band of Apache who had managed to avoid being forced onto the reservation by staying mobile and keeping to the most remote areas of the territory. The initial reception was as difficult as Ayana had predicted. Many of the tribal members viewed Margaret with suspicion and hostility, seeing her as a symbol of the white invasion that had cost them so much. Old women spat on the ground when she passed, and warriors refused to acknowledge her presence. But Margaret had inherited her family's stubbornness along with their wealth, and she was determined to prove herself worthy of Ayana's faith in her. She threw herself into learning Apache customs and language, enduring the painful process of being taught by women who would have preferred to see her gone. Slowly, her persistence began to pay off. Her willingness to do the hardest work, to accept correction without complaint, to learn their ways without trying to change them, gradually earned her a grudging respect. When she successfully tanned her first deer hide, helped deliver a difficult birth, and showed she could keep up during the tribe's nomadic movements, attitudes began to shift. The breakthrough came during a harsh winter storm when Margaret volunteered to ride out into dangerous conditions to search for a lost child. She spent 2 days in freezing rain and snow, following tracks that more experienced hunters had given up on, and finally found the boy sheltering in a cave, alive but near death from exposure. Her successful rescue of the child earned her a new name among the people, Iskar, meaning she who does not give up. It was the first sign that she might truly become one of them rather than remaining forever an outsider. Spring brought new challenges as reports reached them of increased military activity in the region. The army was under pressure to clear all Apache from the territory, and bounties were being offered for proof of Indian deaths. The safe havens that Ayana's people had enjoyed were shrinking as more soldiers and settlers pushed into previously untouched areas. During this time of growing danger, Margaret discovered she was carrying Ayana's child. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. Bringing a child into their uncertain world seemed both a blessing and a terrible risk. But when she saw the wonder and pride in Ayana's eyes as she shared the news, her fears were overwhelmed by love. The baby, a daughter they named Amma, meaning water, was born during the season of falling leaves. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, a living bridge between two worlds that seemed destined for conflict. Margaret had never imagined that love could be as fierce and protective as what she felt holding her daughter for the first time. But their happiness was shadowed by the knowledge that the world they were bringing Amma into was growing more dangerous every day. Stories reached them of other Apache bands being tracked down and destroyed, of entire families killed rather than captured. The reservation system was failing as more tribes chose death over the slow starvation of government supervision. One morning, as Margaret was teaching 3-year-old Amma to weave grass baskets, a lone rider approached their camp. Margaret's heart stopped as she recognized the familiar figure despite years of separation. It was Thomas, her brother, but he looked older, worn down by experiences she could only imagine. Thomas dismounted slowly, his hands visible and empty to show he came in peace. The Apache warriors remained alert, but did not immediately reach for their weapons. They had learned to respect Margaret's judgment about her own people, though they trusted few whites completely. "Margaret," Thomas said, his voice carrying none of the anger she remembered from their last meeting. "I've come to warn you. The army is planning a major campaign. They know about this camp, about you and your family. You have perhaps a week before they arrive in force." Margaret felt the world tilt around her. "How do you know this?" Thomas's laugh was bitter. "Because I've been trying to prevent it for 3 years, using every bit of influence our family name carries, calling in every political favor father left us. But there are limits to what money and connections can accomplish when the government decides to solve a problem with bullets." She studied her brother's face, seeing genuine anguish there. "Why? Why would you help us after what happened between us?" "Because I was wrong," Thomas said simply. "It took me years to understand, but I finally realized that you found something real here, something worth more than all our family's wealth and status. When I learned you had a child, I knew I couldn't let the army destroy what little family I have left." Ayanna stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Years of living as a fugitive had taught him to distrust even apparent allies, especially when they came from the white world. "What you want from us?" he asked bluntly. Thomas reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. "Safe passage to Mexico. I've arranged contacts in Sonora who will help you establish a new life south of the border. The army can't follow you there." Margaret looked at the money, then at her husband's proud face. She knew that accepting charity from her brother would be difficult for Ayanna to bear, but she also knew that their daughter's life hung in the balance. "The others," she said, gesturing toward the rest of the band. "What about them?" Thomas shook his head sadly. "I don't have resources to save everyone, Margaret. I can only offer you and your immediate family a way out." The next few days were among the most difficult of Margaret's life. The decision to abandon the people who had finally accepted her as one of their own felt like betrayal. But when she looked at little Amma playing innocently in the dust, when she thought about the soldiers who would show no mercy to Apache women and children, the choice became clear. Ayanna struggled with the decision even more than Margaret did. These people were his blood, his responsibility. His grandmother had died the previous winter, blessing their union with her final breath and telling him that sometimes love required sacrifices others couldn't understand. But leaving his people to face destruction while he escaped to safety went against every instinct of honor he possessed. It was the tribal elder, an ancient warrior named Geronimo, named after the famous chief, who made the decision for them. "You go," he told Ayanna in their final private conversation. "Take the white woman and the child to safety. Let them live to remember our ways, to tell our stories. That is how our people will truly survive, in the hearts and memories of those who loved us." The night before their departure, the tribe held a ceremony of farewell. Margaret was formally adopted as a daughter of the people, given sacred items to carry with her into her new life. Amma was blessed by the medicine man and given an Apache name that would connect her to her father's heritage, no matter how far they traveled. As dawn broke over the desert, Margaret mounted her horse with Amma, secured in a traditional cradleboard on her back. Ayanna rode beside her, his face stoic, but his eyes betraying the pain of leaving everything he had ever known. Thomas led the way, guiding them toward a future that held promise and uncertainty in equal measures. Behind them, the Apache band broke camp for the last time, scattering in different directions as they had always done when danger threatened. Some would make it to Mexico on their own, others would be caught by the army's sweep. All of them carried forward the traditions and stories that would outlive the political forces trying to destroy them. The journey south took 2 weeks of hard travel through terrain that grew more lush and green as they approached the Mexican border. Thomas had arranged for fresh horses and supplies at several stops along the way, calling in the last of his family's favors to ensure their safe passage. At the border, he embraced Margaret for what they both knew might be the last time. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "You chose love over comfort, truth over convenience. Father would never have understood, but you made the right choice." Margaret felt tears stream down her face as she hugged her brother goodbye. Despite all their differences, all the pain their family had caused each other, he had ultimately proven that blood ties could transcend even the deepest disagreements. In the Mexican state of Sonora, Margaret and Ayana began building a new life with the help of the contacts Thomas had arranged. They settled in a small town where mixed marriages were more common, where Ayana's skills as a tracker and hunter were valued, where Amma could grow up speaking 3 languages and belonging to multiple worlds. Margaret never forgot the lessons she had learned during her transformation, from Boston heiress to Apache wife and mother. She taught Amma about both sides of her heritage, ensuring that the child understood the courage it had taken for her parents to choose love over the expectations of their respective societies. Years later, when Amma was grown and had children of her own, Margaret would tell her grandchildren the story of how a wounded woman and a compassionate warrior had found each other in the desert and discovered that love could bridge any divide. She would speak of the Apache people who had accepted her, of the brother who had risked everything to save her family, of the choice between safety and authenticity that had defined her life. The scars from her original desert wounds had long since faded, but the deeper transformation they had begun would last forever. Margaret had learned that true wealth lay not in inherited privilege, but in the courage to follow one's heart, that civilization was measured not by buildings and machinery, but by compassion and integrity. As the sun set over the mountains of Sonora, painting the sky in the same colors she remembered from that first night in Ayana's hidden canyon, Margaret reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment of peace. She had lost a fortune, but gained a life, abandoned security, but found freedom, left one family, but created another. In the end, the choice between 2 worlds had led her to create a 3rd world, one where love mattered more than law, where character counted more than birthright, where the courage to be true to oneself was the highest form of nobility. It was a world worth fighting for, worth preserving, worth passing on to future generations who would face their own choices between safety and authenticity. What do you think about Margaret's transformation from a sheltered heiress to a woman who chose love over luxury? Have you ever had to choose between security and following your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below about what true courage means to you.